This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. And this is our Some Sunday Context series. Jody Avirgan here. We are bringing you episodes on Sundays that try and help us make sense of life here in 2025. Some are new conversations, some are favorites from the archives. Before we get going, a quick plug for our newsletter. Thanks to everyone who subscribes and shares it. We also have merch and lots more on our website, thisdaypod.org. I do need to update the merch to reflect the name change, though. That's on my list for the summer. Also, thanks to everyone who has been writing reviews of the show on Apple Podcasts and just in general spreading the word about the show. If you want to help us grow, that is a great way to do it. Anyway, today, some Sunday context about airline travel and what happens aboard airplanes. I'm not sure if you've seen the latest season of comedian Nathan Fielder's show, The Rehearsal, but the show, which is ostensibly about how humans talk to each other and the very awkward way in which Fielder can and cannot find emotional connection with the people around him, it basically became a season about airline safety, particularly how in a cockpit, pilots don't often communicate well at critical moments. Fielder has weirdly become both a licensed pilot and an advocate for airline safety. Maybe you saw him on CNN with Wolf Blitzer talking aviation. What a world. But all of us on the podcast watched it, and like many people have many thoughts. I think Fielder is brilliant, and this season made me squirm, and frankly, it made me ask some deep ethical questions about what he's up to and the role of the documentary filmmaker. I think he crossed the line a few times in a way that I'm still thinking through. But I suppose that's the point of art, to make you a little uncomfortable, and I guess to make you think about airline safety policy. And we have done an episode about that. It came out about a year and a half ago, and it's about the larger context of how flying got deregulated and the experience of flying has just gotten worse and worse over the last couple of decades. So we thought we'd run that here. Nathan Fielder is more concerned with the interpersonal dynamics inside a cockpit, but all of that lives within the much larger context of an industry that is overextended and poorly regulated, and we all suffer for it. So here we go, some Sunday context as we head into the summer travel season where flying will surely suck. So take a listen. We'll be back with a new episode on Tuesday. See you then. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 17th, 1978. Americans around the country are beginning their holiday travels, getting ready for road trips and train trips, and of course, the dreaded holiday flight. But one thing to know about the holiday travel season in 1978, it is the last holiday travel season before the Airline Deregulation Act would go into effect starting on January 1st of the next year. And while the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 might be the thing that more than any has led to this modern idea and feeling we have that flying kind of sucks, right? So we figured it would be good to do this episode around this holiday season when many of you are probably going to be asking that question, why does flying suck so much? And here to discuss is Ganesh Sitaraman, author of the new book, Why Flying is Miserable. Ganesh, welcome to the show, and your publisher didn't let you put the word suck in your title, huh? You had to say miserable?
Yeah, I thought it would be a little more accessible to younger readers too, if
Right.
without putting "suck" in the title.
Fair enough. A couple other things about the book. I should point out that the full title is Why Flying is Miserable, and How to Fix It. So we will get to that part too. And Ganesh, you're a professor of law at Vanderbilt University. And guess what? Also here on the show, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
It's nice to have a little Vanderbilt reunion. We've had
That's
so
right.
many. We've had so many Howard University reunions with Kelly Carter Jackson, and now it's finally. But that
Finally,
is
my time in the sun.
that is Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley, Howard alum. Hello, Kelly.
Hey there, guys.
So, Ganesh, you're a professor of law. You worked for Elizabeth Warren, which means you kind of know how legislation gets written, how legislation affects the real world. So I think we can kind of dig into this Airline Deregulation Act with you. Can you take us to the fall of 1978, right before it goes into effect? I mean, what was flying like in that moment? And then we'll talk about how it changed maybe as a result of this act.
I'm going to start actually a little bit before that,
Mm-hmm.
and actually want to go back to 1938, 40 years earlier. And I think a lot of people today don't really know how airline regulation worked before deregulation. And what Congress wanted in the 1930s was to ensure that there was stable, reliable airline service all around the country. And we have a gigantic country, pretty big. And there's a lot of cities, small towns, and they wanted to connect every place together. And so they built a system in which there was a regulator, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they were told to pursue a kind of Goldilocks strategy of regulated competition. Not so much competition that the airlines would price each other out of business, go bankrupt, or need subsidies, and not so little competition that there would be monopolies, and that those monopolies would then exploit people. And so the way the airline did this was through regulating routes. It allocated routes to different airlines. It said, you're an airline, you want to fly a really high volume route like San Francisco to Seattle. That's great. We're also going to make you fly San Francisco to somewhere in Alaska where there's a lot less volume. And that's how we're going to make sure that there's service all over the country. And you're going to make the math work on your end. This was a system that was stable, it was reliable, and it was working pretty well. And it was all based on the idea that airlines were not a normal competitive business like a restaurant or a retailer. They were more like a public utility, an essential service for the country. And so by the time of the 1970s, the airline system was more accessible to people than it had been before. It was safer than it was before. You had these jets that were operating. And because prices were regulated in a way that ensured equal fares for equal miles, so you paid more if you were flying a long distance, less if you're flying a shorter distance, the airlines competed on service. And so in the 70s, you had piano bars in airplanes and steak meals and free alcohol and all kinds of amenities because the airlines needed to entice you to come in. And the way they could do that was better quality service because prices were controlled. And what was so striking in the 70s is that, there were a set of people who thought this was terrible. And they said this whole system looks like a government run cartel. And we should just let airlines fly wherever they want, whenever they want, to charge whatever they want, and everything will be better. We won't have any real downsides, and prices will go down. And that was a pretty good vision, and Congress bought it, and that's what led to the Airline Deregulation Act in '78.
One small little point on that, though. Were prices relatively high? I mean, was air travel affordable for all?
So this is one of the great debates, and maybe the biggest debate, and the biggest talking point you'll hear from people who are pro deregulation is flying was really expensive. Then we had deregulation, and prices have come down, and it's made it more accessible to everyone. And that is true. Flying was more expensive during regulation. It became less expensive afterwards. But what's also true is that if you look at the chart of prices from 1978, to today, you'll see prices going down at a pretty consistent rate. But if you move that chart back to 1950, prices were going down the whole time at a consistent rate. And it wasn't like there was a big disjuncture in 1978 that we could show that was the thing that drove it. Similarly, the number of people flying was going up the whole time from the 1950s onward. And actually, some of the biggest things that made that more accessible were really increases in safety. Where, this is not that in the 1950s, this is not even that old of a technology. I mean, the Wright brothers, 1903. I mean, we're talking less than a half century. First few decades are just figuring out how to fly. You can't really do it at scale. So there's a lot of improvements that happen over time that also increase the number of people flying.
What I love about that earlier model of regulated air travel is that it's such a progressive era New Deal program, right? That idea that it should be regulated like electricity or like telephone lines, because capitalism doesn't necessarily work to serve people with necessary services. The government had to come in to do rural electrification because it didn't make sense for electric companies to lay lines to go to like 5 farmhouses in the middle of nowhere. So the government steps in and it says, no, like these farmhouses deserve to have electricity, and that's going to help the economy overall. It's going to be great for everyone to be hooked up into the electric grid. And they're coming to air travel with that same kind of mindset. Like, let's make this a real connective industry that's available, maybe not at first to everyone because of these very high prices, but let's make it so that it's available to everyone. What's so funny to me is that this argument about like it's become a government cartel. It's like if government cartels had steak dinners, free alcohol, and piano bars, I'd sign me up. That sounds amazing.
I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right, Nikki. It's like the way that we think about Wi-Fi today, and the way that we think this is a necessity. Everyone has to have Wi-Fi. And I think of travel the same way. I live far away from my family. It would take me 2 days at least in a car to be able to get to my family, or any international travel. I mean, you can forget about it if you got to go by boat. But for me, it was the service element that you talked about, especially when you think about service now on airlines is just like in the toilet. Here's your pretzels or peanuts or whatever. But like to think about the luxury that came along with being on an airliner, like the hospitality service, it made you feel like you were a part of something where now you fly and it's just like you're schlepping it to Minnesota or wherever. And it has a completely different feel.
Yeah, that's totally right. And what's wild about it is, to your point, Nicole, like this model of understanding that there are some things that are basic utilities was not just progressive and New Deal. I mean, it really went back to the English common law. I mean, it was hundreds and hundreds of years old. And what was so radical, I think, about deregulation is that the people in the 70s pushing it were just saying that these businesses that are actually different because they have economies of scale and network effects and barriers to entry, all these, economistic sounding things that basically say they're not likely to be very competitive and they're going to be natural monopolies or oligopolies, that we shouldn't have any regulation for those kind of businesses. And that the only thing we should care about is efficiency in a very specific way for the company. And that we shouldn't really value other things like service quality or like geographic access or labor rights or any number of things that we actually do care about as a society. And so it was sort of a weird move to say, let's just let them do whatever they want and assume it's going to work. And one of the things that I found so striking when I was doing the research for the book is how many of the proponents of deregulation basically admitted that they were wrong. And about, within a decade, you've got members of Congress who were saying that they apologized for their vote, that it had devastated their communities, that they wish they could go back and undo it or re-regulate the airlines. You even have Alfred Kahn, the biggest proponent perhaps of airline deregulation, or at least the one most associated with it, who was surprised. He said he was surprised by monopolistic exploitation and mergers and all these bad things that had happened. And there's just a place where, you wonder, well, why haven't we fixed it since then, given that this is something everybody dislikes and some of the people involved recognize that they kind of screwed this up.
So before we get to that question of fixing, I mean, can you paint the landscape of how quickly things change after this act goes into effect? You talked about kind of exploitation and mergers, and I think you mentioned the kind of just go and do whatever the heck you want vibe. I mean, what does that actually look like for airlines, but also for travelers, and how quickly does it change the nature of traveling in this country?
Yeah, so after deregulation in 78, we didn't end up in the dream world that the deregulators promised. What the industry entered into was something more like the Hunger Games, in which all the airlines were.
I didn't see that movie, but that was bad, right?
It was bad. Yeah. It's sort of a cutthroat period of time in which the airlines are in life or death competition, and new entrants come in. They're definitely not serving the remote parts of Alaska. They're serving the high volume, high profit routes, the New York to DC kind of stuff. And they come in with rock bottom prices. They don't have unionized workforces. They don't offer meals or anything. That's where you get peanuts fares. It's just peanuts. That's what they're gonna offer. So no frills service, cheap prices. They come in on these routes, and there's a lot of competition for a few years. And you've got these airlines like People Express and New York Air, bringing something new to the industry. But the big airlines, they fight back and they drop their prices, and to below what the new entrants are offering, they push back on their unions and try to get cuts from their unions, or at least, new benefit terms going forward. So new hires, actually are paid less or have fewer benefits. They would even do things to these startup airlines like sandwich flights. So if you had a 10 a.m. flight, if you were New York Air, a big airline would come in and they would have a 9:58 a.m. flight and a 10:02 flight at a lower price and with higher quality service. And so why would you ever fly New York Air when you can fly a bigger airline with a bigger network at a cheaper price and they've got twice as many flights on the same route? You wouldn't. And that was the point. The point was to get New York Air out of business. And so after dozens of bankruptcies and mergers in the 1980s, by the end of the decade, you've got the same big airlines running the show as we're running it in the 70s, just now without any regulations. So you move from a regulated oligopoly to an unregulated oligopoly in the course of a decade.
Hey there, it's David Plotz, host of Slate's Political Gabfest, the longest-running politics podcast. It can be hard to know what news is worth your attention, which is why every week my co-hosts Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson and I find the most important stories of the week so you don't have to. We dig into everything from Trump's immigration policies to critical court cases and everything in between. We also keep some good humor while doing it.
Why is the Tic Tac shaped that way?
Listen to the Political Gabfest now and join us as we go even deeper on the daily news you're already following. That's Political Gabfest, wherever you get your podcasts.
When you check in on the news each day, doesn't it kind of feel like every story is a head-spinning economic story? Tariffs, meme coins, budget fights, not to mention groceries and gas prices. Economics is everywhere, fueling our lives even where you least expect it. You're a This Day listener, which means I know you love context and hidden history. Well, Planet Money is the show for you. Planet Money recently did an episode that I absolutely loved, all about the more uncommon economic indicators being discussed on social media. Not just the obvious like prices, but sales of lipstick are going up, babysitter buns are coming back into style. A show like Planet Money is built to dig into all the little ways that economics shapes our lives. Every episode of Planet Money is fun, illuminating, and pretty short, 20-ish minutes, and you'll walk away knowing a lot more about how the world really works. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR.
Ganesh, the picture that you're painting is sort of a conservative dream, right? Deregulation, capitalism takes over. But this was spearheaded by people like Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. How do you explain the prominence of Democrats at this early stage of the deregulation craze that would take over the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things going on in the 70s. So first, there's a big economic crisis in the 70s. Inflation, oil shocks, demand goes down for flying. So there's a set of economic conditions in the background that are operating that I think make the set of ideas usually associated with the Chicago School of Economics, a kind of more, government forcing laissez-faire on people might be the way people these days would talk about it. But a move towards more marketization, less regulation, less antitrust enforcement, austerity, trade liberalization. And that neoliberal set of ideas gets picked up on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. And in the 70s, that's combined with the rising consumer movement that's often associated with Ralph Nader, but the Ted Kennedy and Stephen Breyer, later Supreme Court Justice, but then Harvard Law professor and advisor to Ted Kennedy, pick up on. I think it really portends the future in a real way of the deregulation to come that is bipartisan. And that includes deregulation across other areas that were regulated, like utilities. The rest of transportation, buses, as another example, maritime shipping, energy, telecommunications, banking. These were all sectors that were regulated in the earlier period to try to have more reliability, more stability, greater access, and that were then deregulated over the course of the next 30 years. And I think that's part of what's going on is we really had this multi-decade period, the kind of neoliberal era in which the move was let's try to have markets, but we actually didn't get the benefits of that. To the extent that deregulation in airlines was supposed to lead to more competition. One of my favorite stats from the book, there was someone who suggested to Congress, and it was actually quoted in one of the reports, that under deregulation there would be up to 200 airlines operating efficiently and competitively in the system. I don't know what anyone looking at that today, it's like that's insane, right? It's crazy. Today we have 4 big airlines, and they have a bigger market share collectively than the 4 biggest airlines had in the 70s under regulation. So we actually have less competition under deregulation than we had under regulation. I mean, that's a wild turn of events for an ideology that was supposed to be creating more competition.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm sorry, because my husband's a pilot, and I think about these things all the time. So, Ganesh, can we go back? Is it too late to sort of come up with some new system? Is regulation like a shut deal? There's no way to sort of I don't know, convince people to go back to a way that's much more beneficial, certainly for passengers?
Well, I think there's lots of things we can do. And part of the point of the book was to say that none of this is inevitable. We don't have to live with the system we have. It's a public policy choice. I mean, deregulation was a law passed by Congress. Regulation in the 30s were a law passed by Congress. We could change this. And maybe a version of that is going back to what we had before. I think that's, something we could think about. I try to propose in the book some other ideas for how we might get there. Really big, even more radical than going back to re-regulation would be, nationalizing the airlines or having a single public airline regulated as a utility, or one private, airline and one public option airline, which is a system Australia had before they deregulated their system. So there's lots of big ideas we could think about. But I also propose a number of, more achievable ideas, because those would be really big changes for where we are today. And some of those they're really focused on 3 principles. The first is no more flyover country. We've had 74 cities that have lost service from a major carrier since COVID. There are some cities like Toledo, Ohio, Dubuque, Iowa, who've lost service altogether from major carriers. Literally 0 major carriers fly to those cities. And so I don't think that should be something we have in our airline system. We should have access to smaller, mid-sized communities, because air travel is essential for travel, for commerce, for economic growth. Second principle is no bankruptcies, no bailouts. We have a boom and bust system now in the airline industry. There are years where they make money hand over fist. Then there's a big demand shock like 9/11 or COVID. People don't want to fly, and they come running to Congress asking for taxpayer support and bailouts. And that's a bad system too. So we should try to fix that so that all the upsides don't go to the CEOs and shareholders, and the downsides are, given to taxpayers. And then third is fair and transparent pricing. We have a system now where things have just gotten crazy on how complicated pricing is. You pay a different price on Tuesday morning versus Wednesday night, or you got to pay for picking your seat or checking your bag and all this other kind of stuff. We really need to simplify that whole system. And I think if we focus on these big things and try to address them, it would actually sort out a lot of the other little things that make flying more miserable too.
I have a fourth.
Yeah?
I have a fourth. I think
Every
we should
pilot
get
salary gets tripled.
That's okay. I have a fifth. Fourth, higher salaries. A fifth, can we just get rid of the middle seat altogether? I mean, really, why? Why? This is what JetBlue is doing. I noticed on some of their flights, they only have one side of the plane has a middle seat, but they've cut out the middle seat to give more room.
Add it to the list.
Overall.
Yeah. Seat sizing definitely on
Yes.
the list. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, since you spent time in a senator's office, and I want to ask a question about kind of how power works and how messages get through, because I don't know. It seems to me like, I don't like this, but with healthcare, for instance, I understand how senators maybe don't understand what it means to have a precarious healthcare situation, right? They have stable healthcare. They're disconnected from that. So maybe you could say the same for the financial system or other areas. But like, as far as I know, senators and congresspeople have to go to this crappy airport. They have to wait for this crappy plane. They have probably seen the degradation of this experience. So why is that simple thing? And frankly, a lot of, I think, Republican senators are from some of the places you described that are turning into flyover country. Why has it not seeped through to the people who actually are in a position to do something about it?
So I think one of the biggest things is just the conventional wisdom and ideology around this topic. I mean, if you still talk to people over the last decade about this in the policy world, the general view is airline deregulation was hugely successful, maybe one of the most successful policies of all time, and that everything is great and it's all better than it was, and that's good. And that's the general view about this from economists and a lot of other policy people. And it's both a conventional wisdom that's just sort of in the background where people don't really think that hard about it, but it's also an ideological commitment to the kind of neoliberal tenets of deregulation and privatization that I talked about earlier. And I think that's being challenged in a whole bunch of areas now. There's people in the government who are a lot more interested in antitrust than anybody's been interested in 40 years. There's people thinking about trade differently than people have in 40 years. We're now talking about industrial policy in a way that's different than people have in decades. That is a big shift. And I think thinking about regulation in these areas, there's an openness probably to that now in a way that just wasn't there if you were thinking about this in the 90s or even in the 2000s or even in the early 2010s.
But is that in part because people can just sort of see it on the ground, like this experience has gotten worse?
I think it's a mix of seeing it on the ground, but I think it's a mix. It's also partly a function of, in some ways it's almost a cycle of just looking back and saying, wait, we've all had this view for a long time and a whole bunch of things have gone out of whack. And that forces you to then start asking questions that are a little bit more upstream. Maybe our paradigm here was wrong, rather than just there's one small technical thing that's wrong. We've got to move out of that technical sense and up to bigger picture questions. I think we're at a moment now where that kind of reevaluation of the bigger picture is possible. And I hope the book contributes to that and will get people thinking, hey, maybe there's a different way, and maybe we should think about our history differently and what happened, and not have this triumphalist attitude, but see that there were pros and cons to both systems. I mean, regulated system had its cons, the deregulations had its pros, but we need to understand those things and decide maybe we want to make a different set of trade-offs going forward. So to me, Jody, that's the big one. And the second thing is, lobbying is really important, right? I mean, the airlines have lobbyists, and they can run ads and promote their interests, and passengers don't. But what gives me hope is that, people are pretty angry about this and really find it frustrating. I think it's a popular issue for a lot of people, and we get a lot of support. And then the other thing is, on my analysis, I think we're going to have another crisis in the airlines. Maybe it's not this year or next year, but it'll happen eventually, like 9/11, like COVID, and they're going to come to Congress. They're going to ask for a bailout again, or a taxpayer support program or something like that. And my hope is at that moment, the members will say, enough is enough. Like, this time's different. We'll give you the money, but we're also going to put some real rules in place that change how this system works.
All right. Well, I think we will leave it there. This is really fascinating. Now, Ganesh, I want to tell you, sometimes on this show, we do also on this days where we talk about other things that happen on the day that we're running this. And I won't rope you into that, but I will point out, I did notice, this is our December 17th episode. Do you know December 17th in aviation history? You hinted at it earlier.
Other things on December 17th?
A big one that you hinted at earlier.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. 12 seconds.
December 17th was the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk. Yeah, so it went up for like 12 seconds and basically fell apart, which I think I was on a Spirit Airlines flight the other day that basically did the same thing.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Actually, that's nice. 120 years of flight.
Lovely symmetry.
So nice symmetry. So there it is. That's our also on this day. But look, the new book is Why Flying is Miserable and How to Fix It. Ganesh Sitaraman of Vanderbilt is the author of that new book. This has been really, really fascinating. I know there's a ton more history in that, so folks go check it out as you're sitting there waiting for your flight to board, your delayed flight to board. This is a good book to read while you're doing that. So thank you so much for doing this, and happy holidays to you.
Thanks for having me.
And I should say, we just added Ganesh's book to the list that we have of all the books written by authors who we featured on this day this year. So a little bit of a holiday book gift guide if you're looking for something last minute. So there's a link to that book list in our show notes. And also we sent it out in our newsletter. So if you go and find the newsletter archive and subscribe to the newsletter, you will also find that list there. But anyway, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer. Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia.